Not too long ago, I saw a viral video compilation of thieves in low-income areas. People filling up baskets with items and walking out the door, breaking windows, threatening cashiers, that kind of stuff. But one of the 3-second clips in the compilation was something different. In the clip, we can see a group of people walking over a broken glass door, slowly marching. It looks like a riot, but there's more to it. I was there, and I want to tell the whole story. This happened a few years ago. Before heading off to college, I wanted to save up some extra money. I used to live in a pretty shitty neighborhood, and there were only 2 options for a side gig. One was at the local bar, and the other was at a convenience store. I applied at the convenience store, had a quick interview with the manager, and started the following Monday. Now, I gotta stress just how run down this place was. This was the kind of place where the same homeless man sits outside every day, all day, where there were no baskets to carry stuff in. They'd been stolen too many times. There were a dozen signs taped to the door with a dozen little rules, all to prevent the various grifts and thefts that had been attempted over the years. No bags, no backpacks, no plastic bags, no canvas bags, no carts, and of course no weapons. Still, despite its faults, it was the only place local folks could afford to shop at. And while there were some people who took advantage of it, a vast majority loved the place. Right down to the homeless guy chilling by the door. I was planning to be there for the summer. We had a morning and evening shift, and we changed who did what every 2 weeks. The video clip in question took place during my 4th week, my 2nd week at the evening shift. It was a Saturday evening. Benny, the homeless guy, was off to recycle some cans. The AC was acting up, leaving a thin layer of humidity on everything in the store, including me. I was working the counter. It was almost closing time, but I waited for Benny to get back before closing. The guy was harmless and survived on little to nothing. He usually spent what he'd earned during the day before closing time. I wasn't working alone. There was also Lanny, a mother of 3 who wanted to get some extra money on the side while her husband was posted overseas. A woman in her mid-40s with this long black hair that could almost reach her knees. Every time I think of her, I'm reminded of oatmeal cookies. We were ready to close when a customer walked in. I was expecting Benny, so when I turned to see a complete stranger, I was a bit surprised. Now, we get new people all the time, but this one was unusual for a number of reasons. One, he was clearly not a local. The guy was wearing a brand-name blazer and custom-tailored pants. 2, he was in a hurry. He was clutching this brown canvas bag, panting like a tired dog. I didn't get the time to ask him to hand it over as per the sign. You got salt?" he asked. "Mineral salt." "Yeah, go check." He was sprinting down the aisle before I had a chance to finish my sentence. Lonnie peeked out from the dairy aisle with a raised eyebrow. I shrugged. Moments later, there was some commotion. I went to check on the guy and saw that he'd pulled down 6 cans of salt on the floor, opened them, and drowned his bag in it. He was whining and pleading, repeating, come on, come on, come on," over and over. He was in distress, like his life depended on this. I didn't know what to do. I was going to call the police, but I wanted to de-escalate first. Still, I didn't want to talk to him. There was no telling what a guy in his state of mind might do. Instead, I stepped back, got my phone out, and talked to him as calmly as possible. "Sir, you can't do that in here," I said. "You need to pay and take this outside." There's no time," he said. I can't, I'm sorry." What happened next came out of nowhere. One moment I was looking at this crazy guy covering the ground in salt. Next moment, pandemonium. Lonnie screamed at me from the front counter. The lights began to flicker, then die, leaving the store in sudden darkness. Running up to the front counter, my jaw dropped. Lonnie had barely managed to close and lock the front door. There were at least 24 people outside, none of whom I recognized. These people were something else entirely. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them, but looking a little closer, you could see a few things were off. For example, there was a woman in a nightgown. She didn't even have shoes on. A little further back, there was a guy who looked like a political campaigner for a candidate I'd never heard of, and to the side was this really tall man who looked like a fancy sommelier. Except the front of his shirt had been cut to shreds, like he'd been run over by a lawnmower. These people were gathering around the storefront, poking and prodding for a way in. One of them smacked their hand flat on the glass. Lonnie was already calling the police. The store had had security cameras once, but they had long since been wrecked. We just had these camera-looking things that were basically just a red light. It was mostly a deterrent rather than something functional, so there was no way for me to check how many people were really out there. Still, there were more than a few. I didn't even know that one of the front cameras actually worked, providing the clip in question later on. The strange man with the canvas bag was on his knees crying, like full-on wailing like a scared kid. It was eerie to see someone just break down like that. It's at that point you start to realize how serious something really is. We had managed to lock ourselves in. Lonnie was on the phone trying to get the police to hurry. It wasn't easy to get them to come by this neighborhood. Apparently, it was viewed as a bit of a lost cause. They advised her to get out of there and let our insurance company deal with it. The fact that these people showed up out of nowhere didn't seem to bother them, and the fact that our lives were in danger was described as exaggerating. I have this one vivid memory of the beginning of that night. There was this neon sign for a bar across the road, and that was the only light that came through. All these strange people, backlit by this eerie red and blue. It was eerie. There was no way to tell what was going to happen next. Were they there for us? For the store? For the strange man? While Lonnie kept calling for help, I turned my attention to the stranger. He had slumped down against one of the shelves and gone catatonic. He just sat there, staring at the bag. I pushed against his shoulder a bit, and he didn't seem to notice. I decided to check the bag. This, too, garnered no response. The bag contained a sort of metal thermos, a silvery gray container that had burst open. There was a navy blue liquid covering the inside of the bag, now drenched in salt. It had this faint smell of ammonia and had begun to harden into a gel. I did my best not to touch it. "It's too late," the man whispered. "It's too late. It doesn't matter anymore." "What?" I yelled. "What doesn't matter? Who are you?" He waved his head back and forth as if bobbing for an answer, but no words came to mind. He shook his head and sunk his face back into his hands. I tried to push him to answer, but he was just broken. There was no point in talking to him, and judging by the sounds coming from our storage, I didn't have time to stand around. I could hear Lonnie yelling at an emergency responder. I could hear a repeated metal clanking out back, like someone was beating the back door with a steel pipe. Then a grinding metal noise. It took me a moment to realize that they were moving the trash container out back, probably to get up on the roof. I rushed back to Lanny, who was hanging up the phone and trying again, desperate to get someone on the line who was ready to actually listen. "I think they're on the roof," I stuttered. "I think they're climbing." "Shit," she sniffled. "Shit, shit, shit." She took me by the arm and led me to the back storage. There, she pointed to a frail metal ladder leading to a yellow hatch in the ceiling, about 12 feet up. "Make sure it's locked. Block it with something." "With what?" "I don't know." She stormed back out a second later. I grabbed a metal pipe from a vacuum cleaner and painstakingly made my way up the ladder. I managed to lock the hatch and jam the pipe between two handles. It wasn't very stable, but it would hold for a bit. It was probably some kind of rooftop maintenance hatch, most likely for ventilation purposes. The thing hadn't been opened in years. The rust on the metal rungs testified to that. As I was about to climb back down, I stopped. I looked back up. While the hatch was shut, I could tell there was something up there. There was this low huffing noise coming from it. Someone was pressing their face against the other side of the hatch, breathing against it. Out of some morbid curiosity, I crept a little closer. "What do you want?" I spat. "What the hell do you want?" "Home." Something mumbled. Go home. It was such an eerie noise, like someone belching the words rather than speaking them, like an involuntary, painful reaction. More seizure than speech. Home, go home. Then a crash. I hurried down the ladder, rushing towards the front door. This was the scene shown in the clip, a few seconds that we got from the only security camera that intermittently worked. They had broken through the door and were slowly stepping inside. They didn't seem to be in a hurry. If anything, they seemed exhausted. For a second, Lonnie and I just held our breath. There was no way to tell what was going to happen. Finally, a man with a crowbar stepped forward. He looked at us and belched up something dark that covered his chest. Then, as if nothing happened, he walked right past us. The others followed. They were heading for the aisle with the strange man and the canvas bag. Lonnie had given up on calling for help and had resorted to filming instead. It was helpless, but the only thing we could do. We couldn't fight these people, we were outnumbered 10-1. I considered pushing past them and just running into the night, but I didn't want to go near them. There was no telling what would happen if you provoked them. These weren't ordinary people. I can't tell you what was wrong, but I can tell you something was. What happened next you can't see in the clip. 24 people descended on that aisle, picking up that canvas bag and tearing it apart. They were rubbing the contents of the broken thermos thing over themselves, climbing over one another to get every little drop of it. It looked like a goddamn snake pit of arms, heads, and legs. People just devolving into careless meat, completely devoid of conscious thought. Animals. Meanwhile, the strange man was just sitting there, catatonic. As the bag was torn to pieces, a handful of the intruders sort of flopped over. They lay flat on their back, letting their legs and feet curl into something resembling dead branches. Others were making these excruciating, hungry, whining noises, desperately weeping at the empty bag. Then they turned their attention to the stranger. One of them clawed at his leg. He shook them off. Then another did the same. "No," he said. No. It was this weak little grunt, like the man was fighting himself to realize what was about to happen. Lonnie and I shared a terrified look. "The fire extinguisher," Lonnie whispered. "Get the fire extinguisher." It was across the store. As soon as I turned my back on them, I heard the strange man's groaning grow more desperate. It went from a mumble to an angry yell to a desperate plea. Then it was just screaming. Blood-curdling screaming, gaining and losing in strength. I got the fire extinguisher and ran back towards the aisle, meeting Lonnie halfway. She had this haunted look on her face and shook her head. She couldn't close her mouth, like her face was stuck in a panicked, silent scream. She covered her mouth with her hands, shaking like dry leaves. "Oh my God," she huffed. "Oh my fucking God." I didn't see much. There was blood, but like thick blood, chunks of it, tufts of hair, pieces of a torn shirt, bone. A couple intruders were rolling around the bloodied floor like it was catnip. Others were slowly getting up, disillusioned and desperate. One older man, covered mouth to toe in dripping blood, pointed a shaking finger at me and Lonnie. "Them," he coughed. Maybe them." Then they came for us. I didn't realize what was about to happen until they smiled. They clung to this primal hope that we, somehow, had something they needed. Lonnie snapped me out of it, dragging me into the back storage. She fumbled the keys and locked the double doors while I used a broom handle to bar them. There were still banging metal noises coming from both the ceiling hatch and the back door. Then a voice. "Them!" it wheezed. "Them! And from the back door, another voice parroted it. Like a rising storm, the words swept over the invaders until we heard it everywhere. Them. We made our way to the lunchroom before I heard the broom handle crack. They were through the storage doors. Lonnie was desperately dialing her phone while I locked us in the lunchroom, a tiny room with a shared bathroom, a window, and a couple of lockers. I could hear wet skin slap against the window, but I couldn't see what it was. The curtains were drawn. "Fucking yes!" Lonnie cried into her phone. Yes, it's me again. They're getting in there." The window broke. Before I even saw someone, I pulled the safety pin from the extinguisher and blasted whatever was trying to get in. Lonnie fled into the bathroom, locking it behind her. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Someone was crawling through the broken glass of the window. I could see the rough stains of blood against the powdered white. The lunchroom door buckled. I could hear flesh hit concrete as the hatch in the storage broke outside. Someone fell through. It sounded like a hard boot coming down on a wet cabbage. They were breaking through, slowly but surely, all to the sound of a rhythmic them. I swung a locker open, but realized there was no way I could hide in there. I couldn't go for the window, I couldn't push past the doors. This was it was it. To this day, I lay awake thinking about what I felt in that moment. That ice-cold primal panic, forgetting to breathe, feeling your tongue drying up as your airways open up, preparing for a death scream. Then Lonnie pulled me into the bathroom. It was tiny. It was meant for, at best, one average-sized person. I fell backwards, landing with my back against the toilet. Lonnie climbed over me to lock the door just as someone reached the handle. The door opened inwards, so I put up my legs and locked my knees. Lonnie fumbled around in the sink where she'd put her phone. Someone was still on the line, but I suspect all they could hear was our desperate screams and that ever-present mantra of them. The hinges were shaking. The metal handle rattled. I could count every nail on the door and see the minuscule movements as they slowly rolled out. In that moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat and how it slowly synced up to the monotonous chant of them. Looking back at it, my mind is just black. There's nothing there. It's like trying to remember a vague nightmare, something that happened to an unreal version of yourself. And in those moments when you realize that you were there, the real you, then it spirals. And for a couple of skipped heartbeats, I'm back there fighting for my life. I'm back with that chant, that banging on the door. At one point, the door buckled. Fingers poked through the gap, grabbing Lonnie's long black hair. They tore out a handful of it like a full fist. Even in all that panic, I saw her scalp turning red. But we pushed back and the door stayed shut just a little longer. It was still dark. But with every push against the door, and with every inch the door gave, little glimpses of moonlight came through like a sickening strobe light. But a little longer was all we needed. The final thing I heard them say was, "No, home, please home." Then this combination of home, them, please no, and no. The banging slowly stopped. My hearing went from that awful mantra to my own heartbeat, and then nothing. A light breeze perhaps, a careful knock. Lonnie and I held our breaths. "Excuse me, y'all doing all right in there?" Benny, the homeless guy. The coast was clear. Stepping out, there was no one but Benny left. The ground was covered in this black ash, stinking of ammonia and sulfur. But the attackers were gone. The place was a complete mess. Every window and door broken. You could see traces in the ash where people had dragged their feet before they seemingly disappeared. Going back out into the store, there was no sign of the strange man. There was still blood spatter covering the side of the aisle. But now the ground was covered in that awful black ash. I stepped over the broken front door, past the trampled flowers and broken glass. I have this vivid memory of blue petals from a sunflower getting stuck to the side of my black work shoes as I went out into the night. Minutes later, the police showed up, and the rest is history. The whole event was categorized as a sort of riot. No suspect was arrested, and the strange man was never identified. From what I've heard, they never investigated anything as a murder or assault. For all intents and purposes, that night was just a strange break-in. So yes, somehow that clip made its way into a random compilation online. I'm not sure how. Lonnie sent me the link. It's been a few years, but we still keep in touch. Not a lot, though. Seeing one another kind of reminds us about that night, and I think both of us just wants to forget. I guess what I want to say is that some things are different from what they seem, so think twice before you share something. Take a step back, think, and really look.